The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name's Oak Mountain, and today we're speaking with Cari Frame. Cari is a certified coach and a writer with a lifelong study of the transformational power of self-kindness. Her resilience, born from struggle, has compelled Cari's words to the page since she was in her teens, and it forms the foundation of her self-kindness work to this day. Cari's invitation to the world is to imagine what we might be if we were our own biggest supporter rather than our own worst critic. This conversation explores the difference between identity and self-conception, the role of curiosity and humility, and how we might learn to alleviate our own suffering by applying a little bit of Buddhist Dharma. I hope you enjoy. Delightful. Cari, thank you so much for being here today. I'm very excited for the conversation that we're going to have.
I'm glad to be here, Oak. I'm excited about it too.
Absolutely. So I'll start us off with a question I ask every guest, which is, what is the last thing that made you smile?
I guess it was one of my cats this morning. I've been away for a few days, and he has this strange habit of licking the soap. And it just occurred to me like how bizarre and delightful, and it made me laugh this morning. So
Oh, that's adorable. That's so funny. Yep. Cats, man. Animals in general have this way of
yeah,
reminding us about this underlying humor for life. So that's great. Thank you for
yes,
sharing. Now, I recall in our first brief conversation, we spoke about how we actually have a similar background in terms of our academics, how we both share a background in philosophy and the study of religion, particularly the study of Buddhism. And the cat is actually a very fun jumping off point because if I recall correctly, Eckhart Tolle has a book that focuses on the Zen of cats and how there is sort of this innate capacity to be with this present moment that's displayed by our feline companions. So I'm very excited. I'd be curious just to offer maybe a broader picture to the audience. Obviously, they heard me share more about you in the introduction, but I'd love to know how it is you came to be offering the work that you do now.
absolutely, yeah. So I did study religious studies and philosophy, like you did back in university. And then I also worked in health ethics and a few other jobs as well, a few other industries. But underlying all of the work I've done, there's always been a really strong, I've been compelled to want to be with people when they're going through difficult things and just to share space with them, to try to bring some easing of their suffering in those moments. I volunteered on our local suicide hotline for 5 years, and that really instilled in me the commitment to this is the work I'm supposed to do. So then I studied some psychology and kind of quickly realized, I think professional coaching is the path for me because I want to be able to bring tangible support as quickly as possible to people in a very effective and empowering way. So that sent me on the path, and I've been coaching now for 8 years, and I really don't think I will ever not do this work. Like the idea of retirement is kind of not really in the cards, I think, because I'm so interested. It's different every day. Every person in every moment is different, and the support that I can bring is always evolving. So, yeah, and to that point, the focus I've had for many, many years now is ultimately on helping people improve their relationship to themselves, with a particular emphasis on building self-kindness, because it seems to be a foundational piece that helps a lot of people. So that's where I've been focusing.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I hadn't known about your work on the suicide hotline. This is the first time
Oh,
hearing about it. And
oh, okay. Yeah.
I wonder, you know, I remember we spoke about how kindness if I recall you speaking correctly, is maybe a more palatable word for most
Mhm.
people than
Yeah,
something like compassion or
right.
self-love.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you were working on the suicide hotline,
Hmm.
I imagine, and I'd love to hear how this lands for you,
Yeah.
that the other side of this, compassion or self-love and kindness, would have made itself quite clear, sort of the
Yes.
maybe the pitfalls or
Yes.
the anchoring into these depressive experiences. So if you would, or if you can, Cari,
Hmm.
can you tell me what you were able to distill in terms of the things that
Hmm.
lead us astray from
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
self-kindness?
The things that lead us astray. I mean, you're very correct in saying that the antithesis of self-compassion or self-kindness is what leads someone to calling a suicide hotline and being in that place of agony, really, because so much of what I experienced, people, when they're in that place of life is nothing but suffering, and I see no end to it. And there was always, not always, but often an undercurrent of, I am such a bad seed. I am such a bad element. There's no good in me, that it's better for the world if I take myself out. And so to me, that is the, if there was a spectrum from self-love on one side to self-loathing on the other, the place where suicidal ideation and everything really starts to sink in is on the side of the spectrum closer to self-loathing, right? Because there's no hope for themselves to be fixable, to find a way through, to deserve to find a way through, right? And so then the idea of not being alive feels like the right thing to think about, or it feels like relief and that kind of thing. So it's I feel it to be a spectrum, and um, and I think we have the ability to self-reflect and kind of gauge where am I on this spectrum, and what can I do to shift the needle just a little bit towards the self-kindness, self-compassion, self-love side, right? And away from the darkest parts of the spectrum. Yeah. And I feel my work to be that moving of the needle, even if it's just, a millimeter from where they are to something just a little more curious about themselves, a little more possibility or hope. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that there's, in large part, some fundamental beliefs that you were able to identify in the people that you were serving in your time working on the suicide hotline, beliefs about the world, beliefs about self, that if
Mm-hmm.
taken with a full degree of seriousness and believed wholeheartedly,
Mm-hmm.
well, they're irreconcilable with joy, we might say, and they would take one
Yes.
to the point of despair and agony. And so I'm sort of putting a picture together in my head here where, given what you and I both have known about the Buddhist philosophy, and it talks about thoughts, it
Mm-hmm.
talks about mind, it talks about
Yeah.
self, and how the unmitigated and perhaps unbridled mind will necessarily lead us towards
Mm-hmm.
suffering and the
Mm-hmm.
multiplication of suffering.
Right.
How has your grounding in Buddhist Dharma supported your work for those who are experiencing these types of beliefs, who are conceiving of themselves in this way of inherently bad?
Yeah. I think part of what I've learned from the Dharma is the um, how beneficial it is to get curious about your own thoughts, because I find so many people are living in this reality of whatever their thoughts are telling them, particularly about themselves. they take it as truth. And when it hurts, and when it makes them feel like complete garbage, they still take it as truth. And so the hurt of it goes deep, and it can be very destructive, and lead someone to feeling very desperate and very hopeless. So for me to offer up this idea of, what if, when your mind tells you this very cruel thing about who you are, what if it's not true? What if there's something even just a little more true and a little less cruel about who you are? And the light that comes into their eyes sometimes, where they're like, you mean it's not true? Like this monologue, or dialogue, I guess, that's been happening inside my mind my entire adult life, that tells me all these terrible things about myself. There's a possibility that it isn't the truth that I have to be hurt by and live by every moment of the day. Whoa. And it takes quite a bit sometimes for them to start to explore this and see how incredibly open our mind is to actually looking for something that is more true, and how that changes, their entire view of themselves, and view of themselves in the world, right? So yeah, a lot of that does come from studying Buddhism for so long. It's so inherent to how I see myself and the world. And yet I spent a long, long time still believing my negative thoughts about myself. So, I feel their I feel other people's struggle with it very acutely, because I was stuck in it for a long, long time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The question, what if it's not true, reminds me of some of Byron Katie's work, the
Yes,
four
exactly.
questions, right? And
Yes.
for those
Yes.
not familiar, the first question is it true?
Yeah.
Second being, how do you know?
Yeah.
Um, and they carry on from there in this
Yeah.
process of evaluating thoughts that bring on this agony. And I think there's room here to illustrate a very important difference. And listeners would have heard me speak about this before, perhaps, how in today's conception, in today's culture, today's narrative, there's a very clear conflation
Mm.
between self-conception and identity.
Mm.
And what you're speaking to here about the thoughts of how one views oneself or how one
Mhm.
thinks of oneself,
Mhm.
that is self-conception.
Mhm.
It's purely mental. It is purely based on belief or proposition. I'm this,
Mhm.
I'm that. If I'm this,
Mhm.
then I'm that, etc. And that this actually isn't the same thing as identity,
Mhm.
nor is it the same thing as our true self. And when
Mhm.
all of those are put in the pot together,
Yeah.
the emphasis that should be given to our identity and the credence and respect given to identity and the perhaps deep recognition of the relevance of true self, capital S self,
Mm.
are slid over to something that is fabricated, contrived, and based in
Mm.
falsehood. And
Mhm.
so all of our internal orientation structures, well, they're not doing so well in those moments because the place that ought to be serving as a compass is not capable as such. I'd like to
Mhm.
open this up a little bit more and then I'll pass it back to you to see what
Yeah. Yeah.
you think there. So when we're talking about self-conception, these are anything that we can conjure in and of ourselves. It's to say, I am an author. Okay, well, if I say this and I've never written anything, then
Mm.
it's a self-conception that's incongruent with reality.
Mm.
And when that happens, it cannot genuinely become a part of our identity. Why
Mhm.
this is the case is because identity is actually socially negotiated. It is to say that the beings in our environment and our relationship to others and the more than human world inform our identity. That is to say, if I came to you and said, Cari, I'm your boss. I believe I have conceived of myself as your boss, and I need you to work overtime and take care of these tasks for me, you'd look at me and go, Oak, you're off your friggin' rocker, man. Like
Yeah.
I'm not validating that because
Yeah.
it does not work. And so I could not have that as a part of my
Mm,
identity.
mm,
So when it comes to your work and it comes to the role of kindness, this is where I kind of want to shift
yeah.
this inquiry. How is it that we can start to introduce kindness into these self-conception spaces and create a
Mm-hmm.
bit more of that space and a bit more of that levity, such
Mm-hmm.
that the gravity and agony of false conception and false self may
Mm-hmm.
fall away?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is that, um, in my experience with working with people on this for a long time, when you go to something a little closer to what's factual, so maybe closer to what you're talking about with identity, where um, if they're noticing the cruelty of their self conception and they're looking for an alternative or something that they can shift their thought choices to. A really well grounded place is to look to something factual. How do you show up in the world? What have you shown yourself to be in the world? What do the people who know you well say about you? And this one is really, really helpful, especially for people that have such a strong habit of believing the negative self-conception that they'll look for a truth about themselves and all they'll find is the negative because their inner negative habit is so strong. But when you say, like, well, someone that knows you and cares about you, what do they say about who you actually are in the world? And they'll say, oh, well, they say I'm, these few good things. And I'll say, are they lying? Is that just an idea? Or is it who they truly have seen you to be? And they'll say, well, they're not lying. That's who they really see me to be. That's like, okay, sit with that. Sit with the truth of that for a minute. Because the self-concept that's negative is usually, it's not factual. It's very much just like conjecture, opinion. There's no grounding for it in reality, almost always. Whereas something as simple as, I have one friend who knows that I'll be there for them when they need me, and that's true. I will. There's a solidity to that. And when somebody shifts their mind from believing the negative opinion to sort of sinking into the reality, the solidity of the truth, there's a feeling of ease that comes because it's like, oh yeah, that's true. And sometimes I even say to people, like this would hold up in court. If you had to prove the case that this is who you are in the world, there would be proof to back it up. If you took the negative opinion in your mind that's trying to say that you're this bad thing and put that in a courtroom, there would be no proof, right? It's just all up in the air kind of thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a place that I like to try helping people go to because um, there are always facts of how they are something better than whatever that negative self concept is trying to say that they are.
Mm.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're highlighting the relevance and the importance of being in contact with something beyond the mind. And
Yes. Oh, yes.
this this underlies some of the work of David Abram in a book called Spell of the Sensuous, where he draws the, I don't want to say argument, but he makes the connection between meaning in language and the living world itself. And he uses the word instantiation. And so when you were speaking about how other people view us, I wanted to introduce maybe a bit of parsing around what we mean by truth there, because it is
Sure.
important to recognize that how other people view us is not inherently the truth of who we are.
Yes.
However, it does introduce the possibility
Yeah.
of us being something other than this negative self-conception. And so what I wanted to say is that the truth of someone else's experience is that they believe and perceive you to be this thing, not
Yes.
necessarily that you are this thing. However, the fact that they're a living being with reason, with faculties, with sensual experiential capacity means that it's a real person saying something to you, that it's not to
Yes.
be dismissed entirely. And another reason why we ought not dismiss these, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that everything that that person has experienced of you up to
Mm-hmm.
that point has been action, has been words, has been your
Mm-hmm.
character. There's
Yes.
a literal embodiment wherein the mind is necessarily going to be confined by its own perceptual limitations. And this is where we get into something like the negativity bias, right?
Right.
If
Yeah.
I have a belief that's been perhaps ingrained into me because of trauma,
Yeah.
now I've got these little lenses that say everything that
Right.
comes into my world is going to pass through and either validate this particular aspect of my self-conception because it's familiar, comfortable, and forms a part of how I see the world and self, or I'm going to ignore it because that's how the
Mm-hmm.
mind likes to deal with information it can't reconcile. Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
So when we're able to introduce these new ideas, then it sounds like the work that you do, and even the work that people might be doing in and of themselves to introduce these more broad concepts, creates a spaciousness. What I feel literally in my body when I'm listening to you, Cari, is this relaxing and this easing of constriction,
Mm-hmm.
where this chamber or prison of I am the villain or I am
Yeah.
somehow adding negatively to the world starts to dissolve away in the presence of fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where we can actually say, how is it that I'm actually behaving? What are some things that you notice in the people that you work with when they start to shift this needle? I'm curious in terms of, yeah, your recognition in terms of patterns there.
Yeah, there's a few different things that often show up. So there's that initial sort of visceral relief of like, oh, the weight of this fear of, am I really these bad things that is on their mind, and I would say even very much kind of on their body. It eases up a little bit, and they're like, wow, like this is an amazing relief. And then quite often, quickly after, the mind will double down, as it does sometimes, to try to prevent a change in thought process, right? Because so much of how our mind functions is a bit like being a creature of habit. So I can see them seeing a new way to relate to themselves, seeing a possibility of something different, and then very quickly their mind kind of strengthens its path to like, oh no, that can't possibly be true, and here's a whole bunch more things to think negatively about yourself, and or here's the reasons why you don't deserve to feel better, and so there's a natural sort of rebound back to the negativity habit, and I know that. So I see it as a natural part of progress. Um, but for the person experiencing it, they just feel it as, I glimpsed a moment of hope and light for myself, and then it got drowned out by the darkness again, like almost even more darkness than there was before. And so having someone there with them to say, of course it's natural this is happening, that your mind doesn't want you to change, because it even though it's the devil, your mind knows how to think about you in this way because you've been doing it for years and years and years. So it's resisting the change, but that's okay. That's okay, because we're not going to slingshot you from self-loathing to self-love or something terribly dramatic like that. We are going to inch our way, just nudging, and in true Buddhist fashion as well, like thinking of this as a practice. This is a practice of persistence and and non-judgmental application of like, oh yeah, I've gone backwards again. Okay, I've gone backwards. I'm going to reorient myself again, remind myself again, here's what I'm practicing now, and make just that little bit more progress, right? Because that progress definitely starts to compound on itself, and like a snowball rolling uphill kind of thing, as opposed to the negativity part, which also snowballs in the wrong direction. So if they continue with the practice, there is progress over time. But usually there's a bit of that rebound process, um, especially at the beginning. Yeah.
Mm.
You must notice that too with folks that you work with.
Yeah, and even in my own life,
Yes. Yes.
the piece that you're speaking to about the mind's resistance, one of the pieces that I bring into my work is the idea that any time that we branch off of our sense of self,
Mm,
if that branch is not instantiated, true, and verifiable as what it is we are in the world, we have
mm,
created something that is fragile
mm,
and capable of triggering our fight or flight response. The reason why
mhm,
it's capable of doing this is because the mind, when it's working with self conception, puts that as no different than the body. So any habit or any idea that's associated with self-conception, when threatened,
mhm.
therefore becomes life-threatening and will be responded to no different than the death throes of an injured animal. It's like, get away
Right.
from me. How dare you? I got to get out of here. What's going on?
Right.
It's just thrashing and thrashing and thrashing. And one of the pieces I wanted to bring back in that has sort of trickled through as I was listening to you is that kindness is like one facet of this jewel that we're starting to
Mm,
polish when we're working on
right.
training the mind. And some other words came up that I thought might be interesting to just to add on
Yeah.
is we're shifting the mind away from this critical, this judgmental, this diminutive or this punitive mindset into something that is more generous, more
Yes.
gracious,
Hmm.
more forgiving.
Hmm.
There's a shifting in the conception of what it is that we're worthy of, i.e., love, respect, kindness, grace,
Hmm.
etc., mercy, and also a shift in the conception of what value we bring. So I think both of these are very fundamental in terms of
Mm,
our moving in
mm,
relation to the world. Viewing how we ought to be treated is based on what we think our worth is, what we deserve, and then the value we bring forward. And
mm,
recognizing that both of those are aspects of what could be called narrative reasoning, which is the
mhm,
story we tell about the world and self. And what's so beautiful about the work that you do and the work that I do and the work that so many other brilliant minds and hearts are doing on this planet is reminding folks that you can change
mhm,
the narrative.
mm,
You can't change your circumstances to the full degree, right? We can't stop the sun from shining and the moon from spinning,
right.
but the narrative, the meaning making, the story crafting of your life, what these events mean, who you are, and what your value is
Mm,
all within your will. And that's
mhm.
one of the most, in my opinion, empowering
Yeah.
reminders to come into contact with. I think that if
Yes.
that lands for you as well, I feel like that's part of what you're
Absolutely, it
speaking to.
does. And I love the part where you talked about the value you bring because um, it seems to me that oftentimes people who are very hard on themselves and living in a debilitating level of negative self concept, um, who they are being in the world is often quite a good person, and when I say good person, I mean, someone who is um, caring to others, who's making an effort to, bring something to the greater good, or um, you know, who errs on the side of bringing good rather than creating bad, like um, so it's like there's a disconnect between how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves, and the actual value of what they are rippling out into the world, like, in Buddhism, the interconnection of all beings, right? That a small point of kindness from a person who's feeling very, very bad about themselves inside their own mind, but that small point of kindness then has ripples out through the whole web of existence. But they don't know it, they can't see it, they can't feel good about it, right? Because there's a disconnect. So reconnecting them to that value that they just inherently bring, and letting them really feel that you don't even have to change who you are, how you show up. You just need to change the understanding of who you are to be more aligned with, who you actually are, and how you're showing up in the world. Like, and it happens so often, and I don't want to get into it, but it leads into my question for for later. So but yeah, that value that we bring, people tend to focus on the external value, like, have I amassed this much riches or property? Do I show up as socially acceptable, or successful in these particular areas? And if they don't have those, then they feel like they don't bring value. I would say that's especially true for people of the male gender. That they feel like their value is in what they create or what they earn, but the actual value that makes a difference to the world is um, so much deeper and less tangible, I guess. And they don't feel it, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. A lot there.
Yeah.
And on the with that drop of gold, we'll take a short break and come back with the second half of the show.
Okay.
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Welcome back to the second half of this awesome conversation here, which means we are ready for the section I like to call Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guest to bring an inquiry that is relevant to the topic or important to them in some way. So, Cari, what have you got for us this week?
Okay, and I'm excited to bring this to you because I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on it. So the question relates a lot to what we were just talking about, which is the people who are bringing true life-changing value in the world, but they don't feel it in their own self-concept. So the question that boggles my mind on a daily basis is, what is it about good, caring, generous spirited people that they are often also the ones who struggle the most with inner negativity or with negative self-concept?
There's two pieces that arise immediately in response to that question.
Yeah.
The first is an inquiry as to whether or not people of that type are more susceptible to that type of thing. I think that that's a question that I wouldn't say, or a proposition that I'm particularly sold on. So that's one idea. The other piece that I find myself more drawn to, not necessarily to say that it's truer, but I find myself leaning in this direction, is that there is, from what I have seen, the possibility for compensatory action when there is this sense of deficit. So I'll unpack this. a
Mm.
little bit more here. For those who struggle with these types of negative self-conception,
Mm-hmm.
this self-criticism, the
Yeah.
belief in not only their inherent lack of worth, but also the fact that they're detracting from the world.
Mm.
If they have a sense of conscientiousness and a sense of empathy, that is to say, they're not narcissistic,
Right.
borderline psychopath, or sociopath,
Right.
then when they believe that to be true, they will
Mm-hmm.
see their existence as a net negative, as a harm to the
Yeah.
world and to others,
Mm-hmm.
and being empathetic will seek to reconcile. And so this
Okay.
is where we find this compensatory action. It's like, I am
Interesting.
such a piece of
Uh-huh.
garbage
Right.
that everywhere I go, I have to make up for this awful thing that I
Oh.
am in the world, or for how
Huh.
I see myself.
Yeah.
This is what I've noticed in my work, is that people who
Right.
really have this negative view of themselves are tender, they're very generous, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not coming from this place of wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
feels kind of edgy to say, to make such a
Mm-hmm.
bold statement,
Right.
but
Right.
I
Right.
have noticed that it is
Right.
coming from this place of, it's going to take a lot for people to like me. It's going to take a lot for people to love
Mm.
me, and I'm a
Yeah.
burden in my relationships. Therefore,
Ah.
allow me to make my presence around you palatable by
Mm.
changing my behavior in a way that would be more socially acceptable or
Mm.
more likely to garner favor in that way. So that would be the first thing that came to mind.
Interesting. Interesting. I see that. I see that, and I, in my experience with people through work and life, I think I can see that that would be a part of the group. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm trying to think, okay, if it only feels like a part, what is the other, what are the other parts of this group of, um and I'm trying to think, part of, I guess, because what came to my mind when you were talking was like people that tend to struggle with, let's say, people pleasing,
Mm-hmm.
right, where their boundaries are quite fluid around their own needs because they are working hard to be in other people's favor. They're very focused on external validation, because they lack it from within,
Mm-hmm.
right? So absolutely, I think that does play a part. And I also am thinking about people that, um, they're the kind of, caring, altruistic people that prefer no attention. So they almost they're helping, or being of service in small ways, and resist any sense of like acknowledgement of that.
Mm-hmm.
um, but the compulsion to, or not compulsion, but the sort of natural, um, tendency to help people or to be of service, is just completely in contradiction to what they themselves feel worthy of. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've met someone who, they'll be the first to help someone, or without even being asked, that it's just happening. But then if they are in need, and you dare to offer your help or your assistance, and they absolutely push it away, because, um well, I don't always know why, but there's a feeling of, um I'm not worthy of receiving this, right? And so I think that is also another group.
This brings to mind some of the work from a book called The Continuum Concept, which speaks to the incredible importance of the in arms phase for infants. This is from the moment of birth to about
Oh,
18 months or 2 years,
yeah.
and how in our Western culture, most babies are left to cry in a crib,
Right.
where in most indigenous practices, the baby is in human
Right.
contact just about 24 hours a day
Right.
for the first 2 years. And what that does is it fulfills, when that presence is received,
Mm.
it fulfills an expectancy in the developing psychology that we can receive,
Mm-hmm.
that there is energy and support out there for us, and that it's
Mm-hmm.
not a question of if,
Right.
it's where.
Right.
And
Right.
it's right there. It's mom, it's dad, it's community, it's brother, it's auntie, it's whatever.
Yeah.
And for those who have a deep neglect or absence of that particular type of nourishment in early childhood, that receiving is in some senses very foreign. And you can imagine that if someone is, say, in their 30s or their 40s or their 50s, and they're now being met for the first time
Yeah.
in this sensitive space, in
Right.
this vulnerable space, it's like, I am 50
Yeah.
and I'm 2.
Yeah.
And so the reconciling of those two energies is
Push.
just this push
Yeah.
away. Like, I have no cognitive
Yeah.
capacity to know how to navigate this, because right now the part of me that you're speaking to is underdeveloped, it is afraid, and it is deeply in need.
Yeah.
And the only thing that I understand is to protect that. So that's one piece that might be relevant to that topic. I did want to introduce a relevant and healthy opposite to this kind
Yeah.
of behavior that we're talking about, of people pleasing or this compensatory behavior. And I think in its simplest sense, the word authenticity comes forward. And in the work of Susan Campbell, she wrote a book called The 10 Truth Skills. It's called Getting Real, rather. 10 Truth Skills You Need to Live an Authentic Life. She talks about how authenticity is the skill and practice of saying what is true without knowing what's going to happen. And that has to rest, in my estimation and in my personal experience. I don't want to say this is true for everybody. This has definitely been true for me. That my sense of assuredness in my worthiness of love and respect, that has been validated by some extraordinary relationships and friendships that are still flourish in my life. I'm able to step forward and say things that I know are going to be evocative, that might be upsetting to people, that might be scary, that might have them upset or angry, because I have this felt sense somatically in my body that I'm okay.
Right. Yeah.
It's okay for me to be as I am, even if that sets somebody else off. And that's the piece I think that a lot of your work is coming to. It's like,
Yes.
let's scrape away all of this BS from the mind that is lying to you and leading you to agony. And can we bring you back to this place where when you look at yourself in the mirror, when you feel your own heart, when you say your own name, you go, yeah, actually, this is a net good.
And I like that you say scrape away, because that's so often, I think, the experience I've seen people have when they start to question the negative thoughts and they start to connect to something deeper and truer, more factual about who they always have been. It's like a feeling of peeling off the parts that their mind has been telling them belong to them, but they don't. And so once they peel it off, and it's not about becoming a whole new version of themselves or something, it's about peeling off the layers to uncover who you always have been at your deepest, truest place. And that is so relieving for so many people as well, because the mind, the negative habit in the mind is always saying, you inherently are a problem, and only by working hard and striving to be other than whatever you naturally are you going to fix this problem. And so the striving and the fighting against themselves and lack of self-trust and everything, it's so much effort. Whereas the peeling away of all of that and being able to just settle in to themselves is the most transformative lack of effort that a lot of people have ever experienced. Because the lie of the negative self-concept is that you will only ever be acceptable with a lot of change and effort. and probably even then you won't make it. Right?
Mhm.
But heck, why not? You might as well try.
Yeah, this conditional conception is big.
Yeah.
And this is
Oh,
where we put
conditional.
the right, we put the cart before the horse. We say that my peace comes only when, only
Mm.
if.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of a quote, I believe it's from the Tao. It says, "The great way is easy for the one with no preferences."
Mm-hmm.
And that when, and the reason I bring this up is because you're talking about fighting against who we are, right? Recognizing that this resistance to who one is in the moment, the emotions, the needs, the desires, the fears, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
that when there's this fighting against it, this is where we find the pain, we find the great effort and agony.
Mm-hmm.
And I would put it as such: if it's real,
Mm-hmm.
not if it's true, but if it's real, because those are
Mm-hmm.
different,
Mm-hmm.
it will serve to acknowledge and accept it in every case, in every scenario.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a bold statement, right? If it's
Mm-hmm.
real, it would serve us to acknowledge and accept it in every scenario.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between real and true?
Mm-hmm.
Well, real is what is.
Mm-hmm.
What is. This is our emotions, these are our feelings, these are our thoughts, this is the circumstances, what we can perceive, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are all real enough in the fact that they exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they vary in degrees of their truth based on their relationship with what is instantiated, right? So
Okay.
it's real that you're having a thought,
Right.
oh man, I'm such a stinker. It's real that that thought is taking place, right? It's real that I feel a contraction in my gut when I say that.
Mm-hmm.
But the content of the thought is not true. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore we can put it in different places, right? We
Mm-hmm.
don't need to exalt it because it's not true, but we do need to acknowledge and accept its presence if it is real.
Right. Right.
It's like, I like to say, you can't climb a mountain you don't acknowledge is there.
Yes.
So this is one of the key pieces. And I think, maybe you can speak to how this tunes into your work, is that you talked about orientation. And I think that that act, orienting, is the piece that is fundamental in that shift, rather than turning away from how we view ourselves and what we think, and the sort of desire to distance and resist. If we actually come to it and reorient towards it,
Mm-hmm.
and we accept that it's there without believing the contents of it, for
Mm-hmm.
me in my work and the work that I do with my clients, that's the first step. It's like, you got
Yeah,
to look that in the face first.
that's
Does
right.
that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very true. And this is also where this work, I think, I have sometimes people misconstrue it as leaning towards this idea of like toxic positivity. It's like, oh, well, we're getting rid of the negative, right? So I'm just going to I'm going to push that away. Every time it shows up, I'm going to say, no, no, no. And I'm going to force in some kind of positive or kind mantra or something about myself. But that is that is like just switching one stilt for the other. You know, you're still just standing on one stilt, you're just standing on a different one. So what you're saying about orientation is exactly that. It's you have to acknowledge what your mind is doing, the choices that you've been making with the thoughts that you have been living from and feeling in your body and acting on as if they're true. And then really grounding into that, the fact that you get to choose. Once you acknowledge what you've been living within, only then are you able to make a different choice. And the reason too that I find kindness is such a great way in for people is because it's not a huge leap from where they've been. It's just a nudge in a slightly more supportive direction, and it feels doable. It feels like, oh, I can make that little shift, and I can make that choice, And eventually that choice is going to grow, and I'll be able to move more and more towards really believing in who I am inherently and my worthiness. And so when the negativity inevitably shows up, because as we know, it doesn't stop pretty much until we're dead, right? Like it's just a part of the brain. But when it shows up, you see it for what it is. And you can almost like, kind of like, when someone knocks on your door and you're like, oh, I didn't really want to be disturbed right now, but okay, and you you open the door and you see the negativities there. Oh, there's that old negative thought. Okay, yeah, I see what it's doing. I can feel the pull, and I know that I have the ability to decide, is that what I'm going to live by, or am I going to look for something deeper, truer, kinder? And then, um, a lot of the work I do with people too, as a final piece here, is it never ends with just changing how they think about themselves. I believe, and I haven't researched whether science proves this or not, but I've seen it happen. Once you connect to a thought that's kinder, truer about who you are, when people find a small action that builds on that truth, or that is inspired by that truth, and they act on it, like within the next hour, so it has to be something really small, but then there begins more of a feedback loop in the positive direction. If it just stays as a thought, it can be drowned out by the old negativity. But when they take it all the way through to action, and they acknowledge that they've taken that action, it starts to sort of self-support, right? It's a practice that self-supports. Have you found that as well?
What you're speaking to is the power of embodiment, right? We're taking something from
Yeah.
the ethers or the mental space, and we're passing it through our physical form. We literally have to move it through more of our brain, more of our tissues, more
Right.
of our muscles. And what that does is it enlivens it to a greater degree, because it has now contacted more of our humanness, more of our
Yeah.
body.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore there's more cellular, more electric, more
Right.
chemical
Right.
relationship,
Right.
right? There's just more going on,
Yeah.
because I can have a thought and go, pinochle, that's a game, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I go and I play it with my friends, it's a whole immersive sense experience that is now grounded in memory, grounded in the biochemistry, grounded in the neurophysiology. So absolutely. I mean, you saw me nod my head the whole way. I was like, yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. Absolutely. So, Cari, for those of our listeners here who want to deepen their relationship to themselves and develop a greater sense of kindness, where can they find you?
They can find me on social media as the Self Kindness Coach. My website is cariframe.com. YouTube is also Self Kindness Coach. Yes, definitely. There's free quizzes on my website for people that are like, is this something that would even be helpful for me? I run free self kindness retreats online for people that want to sort of have a sense of this in a very live way. So, and I will be having a book coming out as well. So you can look for that too. By the time people hear this, I'll be farther along that path for sure.
Excellent. Of course, as always, all that information will be in the show notes for listeners. So, Cari, thank you so much for your time and contribution today. It was an absolute pleasure to share with you.
Thank you so much, Oak. It was a great pleasure for me as well.
Awesome. And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have two invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.